But Frank, there are a lot of people now who are deciding not to have children at all,
Yeah,
men and women.
Which is unfortunate, I think.
Birth
And what do
rate
you
has
think
declined.
why do you think that's happening? Is it a sort of a discouragement with the future prospect of humankind, or is it just, hey, this isn't going to be good for my career? Or is it the sexual revolution left so much weird baggage behind that no one knows how to navigate? I mean,
It's
there's
all
a
of
real
it.
question. I have no theory. I'm asking you guys. Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. This starts as a Facebook Live event. It then goes on Facebook as a posted recording, on YouTube, through Twitter, and all the other platforms we have, and then as a podcast in 4 or 5 places podcasts are available. And I am the author of a new book called Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. I don't usually mention that up front. I figure the cover behind me is enough of a hint. But in this case, I'm going to go straight into that because my guests today are not only friends, but people who interviewed me about my book, and actually were the first interview I did in any media format. So they had me on their radio program before I got to talk to anybody else about the book. So we go way back, and even more, one of them, Christie, who I'm going to introduce properly in a minute here, read the book in manuscript form, made some great suggestions that made it into the book, and I thank her profusely in the book and the acknowledgement. So, okay, let's be more formal here. My guests today are Maura Carlin and Christie Derrico, who are members of the Women's Business Collaborative and host of the radio show I was on called The Balanced Dilemma. Maura, did I get that all right, or have I screwed it up?
No, you got that right.
Okay.
We turn it into a podcast after we go out on the radio.
Yeah, so it's a podcast and a radio show. And Christie, you both live in, where do you live?
Well, that's a little complicated. Technically, we are in the same jurisdiction, but Maura is in the P.O. box of Larchmont, and I am in Mamaroneck in New York, outside New York City.
Yeah, neither of you are in Connecticut.
No.
It's just, I'm so used to driving down there to visit my daughter who lives in Connecticut, and it's also closely bound together, her exit and then your exit and all the rest of it, that in my head, it's all sort of Connecticut, New York. I can never quite remember where I'm at. So Christie, you are a lawyer. I think your husband is a lawyer as well. Is that right?
Yes, he's a lawyer, he's a trial attorney.
And Maura, when you're not making your radio show, you do a lot of interesting things. Both of you are mothers, and we talk a lot about that in the context of my book. It has a lot to do with parenting, I remember in our discussions. But tell me a little more about yourself, Maura, because I've known Christie a little longer and know more. So can you please talk about yourself a little bit?
Sure. I too am a litigator. Technically, I practiced law for 17 years and then stopped, and I've moved more into journalism, but it was really, we needed some flexibility at home. So I worked with our local TV station for many, many years, as well as I've been the editor of a luxury handbag website. So I've been in journalism now for quite a while. In fact, I met Christie through that TV show.
Now, you guys have also been very involved in terms of not just community, but the kind of issues I talk about in my book. I know that you both have kind of different family experiences. Maura and Christie, what I haven't talked to you about in the past, and I'd like to find out more about in the context of my podcast here, is who you are, in the same way that in my books, I talk about myself as having come from this evangelical background, traveled out of it. I was in on the beginnings of the religious right and the anti-choice movement with my father, Francis Schaeffer, and Dr. C. Everett Koop, Ronald Reagan, Surgeon General. I'm kind of completely on the other side of the political spectrum. And the reason I mention that is because I like to talk with folks here about their journey, and it could have gone in a totally different direction. I'm not fishing for you to fit in with anything I've done. I'm just saying, when I talk about the fact that I got Jeannie, my wife, pregnant when we were 17 and 18, and we've been together 52 years, and we're into the grandparent stage of life, that sort of arc is very interesting. And I think it's a shame, and Christie, I know you and I have talked about this, how people kind of in favor of the careerism that we are in the middle of today almost hide their families, as in, hey, I'm a serious lawyer, or I'm a serious writer. I'm not here to talk about my children or my family or my parents or my mom or my faith. I'm here to talk about, the career aspect, the kind of thing that, gets you promoted and noticed both as a male and a female or a non-binary person. So Maura, talk a little bit about your background. What was your mom like? What were your parents like? What kind of home did you come from? Who were they?
Okay. So I did not have what was considered the typical Westchester County parents. I actually started my life in New York City, but we moved up when I was in elementary school, moved up to Westchester when I was in elementary school. But they were not in business, and they both grew up poor, different degrees of poor. And my father was a graphic artist who had gone to Cooper Union, free school, but where you had to have talent, and actually got a scholarship to Yale for a degree. And my mother insisted on going to college against her parents' will, although it was, local. And she was a teacher. Didn't work for many years, but she did go back when I was about 10 or 11 years old. So, but they were not typical. My father did a lot of art freelance work. And so he worked weird hours, and he would, for his main job, would negotiate time off. I had a father who was home vacuuming Friday afternoon. And I will say it wasn't something I loved at the time, who wanted dad around when you could be free. But it painted a picture for me that was different. My parents were different in that way. I would also say that my father was really a feminist. My mother obviously was too, but I was raised to believe I could do anything. And that was sort of how I went forth in the world. And I went to college. I did everything young. Went to college. I went straight to law school. I went straight into practice, and I worked millions and millions of hours, got married, started a family, and found that we could not, as a family, make it work with two of us in the city working extremely long hours. And so I went home and got involved and shifted.
Yeah. Now, were either of your parents, I always ask this because my dad being an evangelical pastor, it comes readily to mind. Did you grow up with any kind of faith community, or were you more secular, Jewish, Christian, Catholic, what did you get any of that as a child, or were you not, that wasn't what you guys were into?
So both of my parents grew up in Orthodox Jewish families. And together they essentially rejected that. I had a combination, not that we weren't Jewish, but I had a combination of Orthodox and nothing. We had the major holidays mainly because of my grandparents, but we did not belong to a temple. I did not have a bat mitzvah, although I recognize that had I been a boy, that would have happened. A way in which I guess feminism didn't exist in my house, but it was really a combination of nothing, all or nothing.
Yeah, and what was the kind of ethnic background? How many generations into the U.S. experience were your parents?
My parents were firstborn.
And where did their grandparents or parents come from?
Their parents it was Eastern Europe, whether you called it Hungary, Poland, or Russia.
Yeah,
somewhere the lines kept moving.
Yeah. Then, Christie, turning to you, can you sort of give me a little bit of a similar narrative in terms of your background, who your parents were, the kind of people, the background that you had in terms of religion or no religion, just sort of how did you form? So we've got the kind of high holidays and nothing. I think that's a great description, by the way, Maura. I just love that turn of phrase, holidays and nothing. That fits a lot of people, I think, both from Christian and Jewish backgrounds or other. So, Christie, can you kind of fill us in?
Catholics, I grew up Catholic, and Catholics would call it Christmas and Easter. Okay. Catholics. And I grew up in New Jersey, had a lovely suburban childhood. My mother did work. and my grandmother worked, but it was always in a very economical fashion. My grandmother ran a business, and I do not think if my grandmother were here today, she would ever describe herself as a working mother. She was a mother first, and all of that other stuff was just something else she did that she squeezed in. And but she did establish a really thriving business with my grandfather, and we've all learned from that. I worked in the business. My mother worked for a pharmaceutical company.
What was that business?
Catering.
Catering. Okay, great.
Yes, and it's still in business. And my two aunts run the business, and we could have a whole conversation. It's not something that we ever take a moment to applaud as an example of feminism. It's just something that you do. And it's very family oriented.
Was it out of the home, or did they have a location they ran it from?
Good question. So all three businesses, my grandmother, my mother's, and mine, started in our basements. Their basements were much nicer than mine. Mine is very cold in a 120-year-old house, as you can see from the radiators. Yeah. But my grandfather built my grandmother a commercial kitchen in her basement. I don't think she ever did any parties there. I think they ended up buying a catering hall, and they had a little lake house that they sold, and they bought the business, and that was it. Then they were all about business for all of my childhood. But my mother went to college when I was a girl, and I was having this discussion with her recently. She was also a guest on our show on The Balanced Dilemma. Her name's Pat Sigman. And I remember being very small in the pre-K at the community college in our town and crying terribly, wanting my mother. And she was in a classroom, and she thought she was going to be a New York City school teacher. So she studied, I think she was aiming either for biology or chemistry. And she took a course on computer programming. And that was it. She said in our podcast, she describes the language popping up in her dreams. Like that was it. Once she was very good in math, and that became her passion. And she ended up getting a degree in computer science that who knew? So my mother was a pioneer and went to work for a pharmaceutical company. And that was probably when I was in middle school. And then again, while she was there, she saw something called consulting. And the pharmaceutical company had an aspect that did that. So she thought, aha, I want to have a third child. I'll learn consulting, and then I'll leave this business and go start a business on my own, and I'll be able to have the baby. My brother is 6 months younger than he would be because she got stuck on an assignment and they wouldn't let her start the consulting for 6 months. So she had to wait. But then we did eventually get my brother, and she started this business in our basement. And I have had computers in the home since I was in middle school.
Wow.
And
early.
Yes. So, and I used to do data entry for her. And when she was in college, she'd bring me to see the mainframe computers at Rutgers University. So my mother also, although she was a working woman, would never, in my opinion, describe herself as someone to be applauded for not being at home and having really horrible hours and something like, oh, I made partner. That would never be in her vernacular. She would say the family comes first. And we have a laugh. One time my mother could have gotten a promotion or something, and it involved traveling. And she was crying to my grandmother and saying, I can't do that. I'm missing out on this opportunity. So my grandmother very dryly says, you should have thought of that before you had children. And that was it. The conversation's over. So she started this business, which she sold a few years ago. So I've had a very different, I guess they're teaching young people how to blend. You're opening the conversation on this. How do we blend careerism with family? But it was just something that was indoctrinated in our family. My mother's goal is, how can you make the most amount of money in the least amount of time so you have the most flexibility? And I carried that through, and I started a law firm, and I've basically been self-employed my entire career, which is, has ups and downs, but that's how I met Maura. And that's the funny story. She was interviewing me, and
interviewing you for what? As a journalist?
Yes, on a local television show.
On a local TV show. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. And she remembers this differently, but my recollection was that Maura walked in and said, I just left a shit show at home. And I'm sorry, I don't know if this has to be PG and if I violated any
we're
rules.
fine. We have all sorts of language on this show.
But I said, oh, great. Now I can be honest with this nice woman I met and tell her I just left a shit show too. And I'm barely here and I have to put makeup on in the bathroom so we can go on air. And we're going to make it look nice and easy, but it was not easy getting here.
Yeah.
And that began a friendship. And this continued. Maura found this article that she's going to tell you about. And we've been talking about this for, it's like 8 years now. And a long time. So, and then we had a show on local access and then we brought it to the radio. But really, it's all about bouncing off of each other. How do you stay in? How do you survive? How do you keep your identity? How do you stay sane? You know, it's been a real, I consider us at this point social scientists that we have embarked upon this conversation.
Yeah. And, you know, when we first met Christie, it was in the context of our mutual friend, Jose Zylstra, who introduced us and said she was reading a manuscript of my book as well. And she says, oh, you should send it to my friend Christie. And then, of course, you know, since you have your show together, you know, you got in pretty early in this process with the development of my book. And then, you know, just coincidentally, the way things worked out, a lot of the themes that I talk about in the book actually mirror what you and Maura are doing anyway, in the sense of how you met, you know, the shit show at home and balancing things out and career versus all this. But and Maura and Christie, obviously forgive me if I push on things that are, you know, because frankly I can't remember what we were talking about in the parking lot of your TV station and what we did on air. So, you know, forgive me if I presume on my friendship here, but I tend to forget I'm doing an interview that other people are seeing, and I just sort of get into the subject. But what struck me about you guys comparing notes on your kind of feminist journeys and faith journeys, or no faith, however you want to put it, motherhood and so forth, was that, you know, Maura, you've had some steep mountains to climb in terms of the mothering experience, which have left you, you know, ready to say, hey, look, this isn't always about, you know, making people happy being a parent. It's a tough road. And I just remember talking to you about that and feeling that you had a very realistic kind of take on it. And then, Christie, you come out a little differently. And I just wonder if you guys have talked about that on the air together, or whether it only comes up if a guest brings it up, or maybe you just don't even go there. How do you work that out? Because you actually,
Maura, I think the quote from Susanna, our guest, Susanna Hurlitz had a quote that she said on the air, that you know, carry on even when your kids are not happy. Right. You know, I'm kind of contaminating it a little bit, but we didn't know if she would continue that conversation on air, and she did, because she made a life for herself, even though her children, some of them, were not totally perfect and happy. Yeah. And so we do carry the conversation and try to be polite to people's boundaries, but it's something that needs to be said.
So Maura, talk a little bit about your experiences, because I know you have done some heavy lifting.
Okay, I will just say that I am always a bit circumspect about it, because my children either will be someday adults, and a lot of it becomes their story. So there are parts that I am public about, which is that there were learning issues and ADHD, and I have 3 boys. But you know, we had 2 adults working very, very long hours in the city, and these were issues that required some parental attention. The 3rd one also has, and we are again public about this, and we advocate for it. My son does also. He has Tourette syndrome, and he has a complicated case that involves a whole lot of things, including differences about education, medication. There's a whole coterie of doctors, and it really was a full-time job, having to manage that. So that really did take over, and it was difficult. There was no way one could do everything. I didn't think, or I was not capable of it. Someone else might have been. And I've had to come to accept that. Yeah,
no. Go ahead, Christie.
There's something
and I just want to say, for the decision that I made, that I was going to stop practicing law and certainly not be away and be the one that was more home and flexible, I don't regret the decision. It was the right thing to do at that time.
Yeah, and let me, and then Christie, I know you were going to jump in, but I'll just throw this in first. How has that experience of jumping out of working in the legal profession into this caregiving profession that was motherhood plus, if you want to put it that way, change the way you interview people and deal with the subjects that come before you in terms of family, work, and all these other things? It must inform the way you see things, that takes you a little bit in a different direction than perhaps some other women go in, or some men, or people who write about business and all these kind of things. How has that kind of formed who you are now in terms of an interviewer when you're talking to somebody?
I think it makes me want to really hear the full story and not just the glossed over branding presentation. I want to know what really happened, because I guess I'm, color me cynical, but it's never as easy or as straightforward as people want to present. And I mean, that's part of what Christie was saying when I walked in and said that, which I don't remember. And I was horrified that I did, because it's not very professional. But I am not, and I never was one to pretend things were really different than they are. I don't really care what the public appearance is. So, but I want to know what was really going on. And I do think that informs how I ask people questions.
Yeah, because when you were interviewing me, I can't remember the exact details of the interview, but it seemed to me that both of you were very much on that page, which always tells me I'm dealing with people who have some life experience. It may be different than mine, but we're not starting with a blank page here. They kind of have a sense of how things really go down. And it's never quite the public persona or the polished image, is it?
Well, we interviewed Andy Simon, who has written several books, and one of them is Rethink. And
Right.
She is a social scientist, also an anthropologist. But her book only seemed to show positive outcomes. And I think it was off the air. We had a conversation and said, but Andy, is this the full story? And she made a point. She thought that it would be a good vehicle to show success. And you could see how that's important. Maura and I think it's important for us to show the underside, because part of the problem in dealing with women and men with family issues is sometimes a feeling of failure, sometimes a feeling, maybe of embarrassment, and that's part of the disclosing. So now we've had COVID, and people have had Zoom meetings where it's been invaded by a little person, and we've all just said, okay, carry on. This is okay. At another time, that wouldn't have been the case. So if you had to say to your boss, look, I have to, take Fridays off because my child has, an appointment for speech or something, you would be loathed to say that to your boss for fear that they would think that you were not professional. So now these changes have given an opportunity. Where we're going to go with it, we'll have to see. But we are always trying to ask the question about what's the real story, because that's the point of our mission.
Yeah, I
Christie,
remember. Go ahead. Sorry.
What I was going to say was that in this, we've asked a lot of guests the question of, would you put motherhood on your resume or bio? And the answer is very mixed. But the one thing, Christie, about being honest about where you are, and Christie's very honest about the fact that she's not fully open about where she is. But most of them are, I think. But they're very mixed on whether motherhood goes on the resume. I remember Carol saying, Carol is not available, goes on my calendar.
Yeah, that's
Right.
about it. I remember I interviewed Andy as well about her book. And Christie, I think I quote you in my book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. I think I quote you, I thank you in the acknowledgements. I think I actually quote you telling me that you and other women you knew, I hope I'm not using too harsh a word here, but, got into the habit almost of hiding or even lying about where you were, trying to pretend you were living a more professional life than you were, because you didn't want people thinking, oh, well, she's not in the office doing something serious. She's, quote, just fill in the blank, caring for her elderly mother, doing a school pickup. taking care of her husband who's sick that day, anything that makes it look as if you're not hard professional. I quote you in the book as talking about that. And then I have a little piece by my daughter, who's a CEO of a little company in New York, saying that she was so relieved during Zoom because some of the men she was working with, just what you were saying, their toddler would run through the Zoom meeting. And I quote her as talking about this bank president she was talking to, who says, we have to speak quietly because I just put my toddler down for a nap. She didn't even know he had a family. It was off limits. And he'd never ask her, because that would have been seen as a male demeaning a woman by asking her about family when it's supposed to be all business. It just seems we're at a place where there's a real tension between these things. If you're asking that question to women on your show, I guess you agree. I'm interested that most of them are saying they would put family down as a resume, because I know my daughter gives talks about being a CEO and people say, well, how did all this work out? And she says, she sort of draws a blank stare when she says, I learned far more from being a mother than I did by anything in the business world I've done. And a lot of people don't like that, both men and women. It feels unprofessional to them. And it's like, they see that as a step back. Oh, please, let's not talk about parenthood. Let's keep this professional. Where does that come from? And how do you both react to my little rambling half-baked speech here?
No, it's a pretty good speech, Frank, and your book was great. Really, that whole comment about admitting where you are. I know women who've negotiated major cases locked in their bathroom hiding from the family, and they tell you that as if they've confessed something, a big secret. That came out of a Women in Technology panel that Jose Kidder had for the Women's Entrepreneurial Network. And one of the speakers said, let's make a pledge to stop lying about where we are. And I was so floored that they were admitting. I didn't realize I was part of a group, that this was a movement. Mm-hmm. But in our family with a business, it was very serious. Even though it was a family business, you weren't running around the hallways. They had clients, they had events. So children were not on the premises in a business setting. But I think that one thing we've touched upon is something I've been thinking about, tossing around, is periodizing your life. There are seasons when you do things, times that you do things. But one thing we have found with this whole, motherhood on your resume, it's a lot easier to admit you're a mother when you have seniority, when you're an entrepreneur and self-employed, and when you have longevity, which ties into something you've had in your book, to, stay put and be someplace for a long period of time. If you're working somewhere and they know that you're a quality employee, it's easier to ask for accommodations. But a lot of the women who are saying, oh, sure, I admit I have kids, I put it right in my calendar, they're senior executives. How does that play out when you're a young person starting out, and maybe you have a child at home, and that puts you in a certain light that you started a family sooner? It just opens the door to a whole conversation that they might not want to open the door on. So I think that's why Maura and I have seen different responses from different people. And Maura, as the journalist, has been really good about leaning into conversations to say, do you have the same policy for your employees? Because it's one thing to say, I'm going to put it on my calendar. Are you telling me that you're going to accept from everyone else in the firm that they have to leave at 3 o'clock for school pickup? It's a broader conversation, and I don't think there's a uniform answer.
Yeah, Maura, I'd like your reaction on something. Let me just break here for a second to say this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, a podcast. I'm talking to two really lovely people and friends of mine, Maura Carlin and Christie Derrico, and they have a show which they interviewed me on a while back on my book called The Balance Dilemma. That's not my book, that's their show. And we're the first people to pay attention to my book in any media sense. So Maura, let me ask, in my book, I finished the last draft when we were still doing all the COVID sheltering and beyond that point. And it seems to me that with these things, the media calls the Great Resignation, and people saying they're going to work at home. And by the way, yesterday or the day before, I was on a meeting with the WBC, listening to a presentation by the former president of Sprint, who turned that whole company around, talking about the fact that as far as he was concerned, at least 40% of the workforce in his company and all companies are going to keep working from home. That's the future. So talk a little bit about what you're discovering for yourselves as you interview people about maybe a broadening perspective that is less something to do with them making a decision. Okay, I'm not going to hide the fact I have a family and this balanced dilemma business, but do what my son John did, who lives up the road, whose kids I take care of. I'll be picking Nora up at school after this, and just told his company, where he's a project manager for a science high-tech company, I'll find another job unless I can keep working from home. This is it. I'm doing this now. I'll come in 1 day a week for a meeting at the office with the science team that have labs there. Otherwise, I'm working from home. And so that's it. He's done. So how are you running into changed attitudes in the women's community, or just generally speaking, that come from this moment in time that maybe we all didn't foresee 2-3 years ago?
Well, first of all, not everyone can work from home,
right?
Even if they want to.
Yes.
Medical profession, people who take care of your children. I mean, there are a whole lot of jobs where you cannot work from home. And often those are jobs that women have, particularly in the home health care and taking care of children. So you've got a whole swath of people for whom it's just not applicable or possible. I actually was in a conversation with a dear friend of mine the other day who's senior, manages a whole bunch of people and has an employee who wants to continue to work from home even as they go back to work, and is really struggling with what decision to make, because there is a feeling that people do need to be at work full time. Even one of the lawyers we interviewed, a woman who is a partner at a firm, and the firm has decided to go back some days a week. I mean, whether she wants to or not, that's what they have to do. So yes, I do think there's more flexibility. I'm thinking, Christie, of Joanne. She's in finance. She's very senior. She's had flexibility her entire career and is finding that working from home for everyone is fine, and is willing to be flexible as long as you're producing. It's a business where if you bring in the money and if you're doing well, you can do whatever you want. They don't really care where you're doing it as long as it's done. But it's not like that for everyone.
Yeah, which brings me to another subject that I know you all are very concerned with, and I am too. We had a wonderful guest on who, Ernie, my producer, will now send me a little note, remind me of her name. I think her first name was Amanda. And she is a pastor in a progressive church in Manhattan with little children, living in a little apartment and sheltering with them. And she was begging me to beg men to take full advantage of and insist, Amanda Hambrick Ashcroft. And by the way, you ought to get in touch with Ernie and book her, because she's a great guest. Wonderful, wonderful perspective as a mom and a pastor and a progressive religious person, and just a terrific, wonderful woman. But she was talking about her experience during COVID and came up with some wonderful phrases to describe herself during that to people, and why she was not going to do what they expected her to do, because she's at home with kids and she's not pretending otherwise, taking care of these little kids. But she was saying, one of the big problems is not insisting that women have paid maternity leave, but that the men who are offered paternity leave by some corporations sometimes don't take it. And so it makes it look like even more of a burden, that see, the women want to do this, but the men are more serious. And she was saying, look, if you're a man and you care about gender equity, for God's sake, take advantage of everything offered you by the company. So it's not just like, oh, this is just something women do, and push for that. And then, of course, the other side of that coin that I want you to address is just how disgusting it is that we're talking about paternity and maternity leave, if at all, in terms of weeks and not months, as if, you'd think our lifespan is 19 years. I mean, our whole lifespan, if you've got to cram a little child experience into a couple of weeks and that was it. I mean, this is insane compared to other parts of the world. So go there, talk about people you talk to and what you think about it.
It's really funny you should say this, because I did have an article here to say, to bring up today, Dear Care and Feeding, my husband is refusing to take his paid paternity leave and I'm furious. We have found that, according to our research, taking paternity leave will normalize the experience of having time out of work for women, okay? But we were very interested. We've had three male guests who were caregivers to their children or involved on some level, not the old fashioned, I leave the house and don't come back till 7 and I have nothing to do with my kids. One, John Brisson, took full care of the kids. They did go to daycare, but he was the point person. He was the lead parent. And another guest took paternity leave, and Maura found this guest, and he was the first male she knew to take it. One question we had was, are they taking paternity leave, but they still have a nanny at home? Are they taking paternity leave at the same time as their wife? And it was very interesting. Carol Villejas said that they stacked the maternity and paternity leave to lengthen the amount of time they would need to hire a professional nanny or childcare because it's so expensive. So these were all questions. And I think Steph said a similar thing. His wife took one semester, he took the next. They were both in teaching. So this really is a conversation. There's benefits to taking it, but it's really showing that people are trying to improve the new parent experience. And similar to what Maura started this conversation with, little babies, sometimes you just need a family member there. There's great caregivers. I've had tremendous help with my children, but it's a really hard job and it's precious cargo. So we need to be aware of that. There are some professions that this is going to be difficult. It's not a one size fits all. And this is where I think employers need to step up to the plate. Otherwise, the government's going to decide it for them, and they may not like that, what the outcome is. So we need to work together to give opportunities to employees.
Frank, what I'll just pop in here is that, Christie and I don't talk politics. That we've sort of made a decision that we don't talk that. And the one policy we talk about does have to do with childcare, and that all these years later, there's no great solution. In fact, a lot of this started with an article I found in my attic. You know how your parents get everything of yours out of their house. And I finally started looking through it, 12 years ago. And I found this article from 1980. I have no idea, not 81. I have no idea where and how I got it. It's called Confessions of a Superwoman. And it's about a prominent woman who just can't make it work. With one child, I think it was really the house in the suburbs that put her over the edge. But here we were 30, 40 years later, and we were talking about it in the same terms as this woman in 1980. And that was sort of frightening, and, it was jarring that we've gotten nowhere.
We don't want to get sidelined with policy discussions, but why are we not having these conversations? Why are there graveyards of childcare in this country where there's places where there's no daycares? And could you imagine being a young family? I mean, if you do have a grandparent who can help or an aunt, that's wonderful, but not everyone has that. So schools should be providing after and early care for children. Younger ages, they should maybe do things like change the tax codes so that daycares are considered tax-free entities. I'm just throwing things out there, but from both sides of the aisle, we can have a conversation where we can make this easier so that we can keep people in the workforce and offer support. Because what the pandemic showed was that people broke under the stress. And although we're glorifying all these options, let's not forget, in some ways, technology has made the workday longer. And the children sitting at home doing Zoom while parents are supposed to be working, let's not make it too glorious here. You're having to do two things at the same time, and that's not really possible. So we need to give options to young families. And I am very pro-business. I'm not going to support plans that don't help businesses keep their doors open and make the finances untenable. But how can we create changes that will support everyone? This applies to all socioeconomic groups. And I think we have to have more discussions about it, more ideas, and just make it happen. There are less daycares now than when I was a young parent where we live. Some states are different, but in New York, where Maura and I are, there are almost no daycares. And I don't know what parents do. One daycare I heard, I think, was $2,500 a month for a child that's a year old. And that is nationwide. Daycare can be as much as a mortgage.
Yeah, it's just insane. You wonder if in looking back someday, well, it'll be like one of those things with smoking when people said it was okay for you. And then later, 50 years later, you're saying, what were they thinking? This is a real question. There's no hook here. I'm not trying to put an idea out here that I haven't thought through, but it just seems to me we're sort of in a transition between going from a predominantly male workforce to a mixed workforce with females and moms as well as dads. We're in a transition from seeing males in what we thought of as quote unquote traditional roles to realizing that actually beyond business tradition, there's an even more ancient tradition, and that is our evolutionary history that I talk about in my book, where males actually did evolve as caregivers. It really does take a village, and it isn't like because Hillary Clinton said so, or Jesus says, be nice to people. It's because there's no human survival without the it takes a village. The communities that survived did so because they cooperated. Otherwise, they died off. So it was never about the survival of the fittest. It's always the survival of the friendliest. So we have this weird thing where we're coming out of an industrial period of history that started in the 19th century in the US and also in Europe, where, the man goes to work, as opposed to, say, the village. I grew up on a Swiss mountainside where you looked out and the family's all out there working together, turning the hay in the summer and taking turns, milking cows and doing chickens. And there's not this sort of division between work and life and female and male in the same way that we have today. But this transition seems to not be working out very comfortably. And I was struck by a poll I read the other day saying that this annual poll they've been doing, I think for the last 80 years on just sort of general satisfaction and happiness, finds that according to this poll anyway, women polled today are less happy now that they rate their happiness than the poll numbers were in 1960. So that's amazing to me. And that's with all the additional opportunity. So all I would just say is that, whether it's the loneliness statistics or a poll like the one I cited, and a lot of other indicators, what we're doing does not seem to be working well when it comes to people finding joy in life, not just career, but life. What is, from the people you're interviewing and then your personal experiences, what could we be doing differently, including for people who are not in the upper middle class? The woman working 2 jobs, let's change her pay. Let's go to a higher minimum wage. What are the things, if you guys could, in your life experience, if you could push a button today and say, here are 3 things or 5 things that would change, whether it's attitudes or legislation or our economy or the way we see ourselves, how would we make this a more comfortable, joyful situation for everybody across the board in all socioeconomic branches in terms of this family, work, uncomfortable, difficult, tough thing we're in? Because it's not making people happy.
Maura, you want to go first?
Well, Frank, I think that the demands on women since the time, that 1960s, are far greater than they were back then. And part of it is, yes, there is greater opportunity, but these expectations, you are now expected to have some kind of career and also have a family, and parenting has become a verb. Our parents did not monitor us or drive us around the way we are expected to. I mean, the demands are so much greater. And so I do think we need to find a way to dial some of that back. Christie, I'm going to let you go now.
Okay. It's funny you should say this. So in talking about this periodizing your life that Maura and I have been bouncing around, I had heard a podcast about a man saying how he did it, what his special sauce was. And he started to say that he slept outside in a tent for the past 2 years and alone. And he found that helped him get his ideas flowing, and he could turn his cell phone off and nobody was allowed to talk to him till noon every day. And I came in and I said to Maura, oh, that's really funny. Could you imagine if we slept in a tent, we would be reported to DSS for leaving our children inside. And if we were not accessible to noon every day, what happens if your child's at school and they have a high fever and you have to go pick them up? Some of these things are not applicable to women. But going to your question of joy, having time with your family, I think, can give you joy. And I do think that this over-parenting culture that we have been involved with and that has developed, especially in affluent families, is detracting from joy. I think that it's a cultural thing that's related, as you said, to this this concept of judging ourselves based upon our careerism. I agree with you, and that's why I tapped into a lot in your manuscript that is detracting from joy. But I think we have found in our guests people who have found joy in their hobbies, in their special projects. We've had artists, authors, business owners. They've had a lot of joy with that.
And people who what they're doing has purpose.
Yes, I agree.
Let me ask you both a question. This is always a tough one for me because I'm not exempt from this. You know, when I was writing my book, I was thinking to myself, I would give myself little speeches and I would put disclaimers in, but you know, a disclaimer is hollow. And I would say, well, obviously, you know, I'm writing from the point of view of a white entitled person. I'm not experienced what a Black man experiences at a traffic stop, let alone a woman experiences in everyday sexism. I would say all that. That said, you know, we're sitting here talking about one strata most of the time. And yet, you know, every time I go to Walmart or I pick up some fast food somewhere and I look at the woman serving me and I realize that she's living not just paycheck to paycheck, but probably working 2 or 3 jobs. If she gets pregnant and has a child, or I should say when she does, and I'm not getting too graphic, I hope here, but just to drive the point home, you know, she's back at work, say after a C-section, while she's still got a bandage on. Nobody's giving her anything. And if she's doing childcare, then she's doing her own and working for a wealthier woman, maybe a white woman, maybe not a white woman, but nevertheless, there is a class of people in our country who I think it's not just a question of joy. They are being crushed by the system. And they're being, you know, their hearts are being squeezed. And this ridiculous thing of, well, it's a land of opportunity. And my grandparents started and it was tough for them too. We all have to begin somewhere. Okay, that's fine. But I just think that women in that situation are exponentially worse off than males. And they get hammered because they are childbearers. Their bodies
And it doesn't end with the childbearing because they are also the ones who need to do the elder care.
Yeah, that's what I say.
So you get it right.
Well, you know what the difference is here, Frank? It's money. Women need money and they need to learn how, and you are behind the 8 ball if you lose that opportunity. There is a website you can go to that you could do a calculation for how much money you lose for every year you're out of the workforce. Now, I'm not advocating that I want all women to run out and work. I've worked part-time, no time, full-time. It can't be one thing at every time, but we've talked about Indra Nooyi's new biography. She's, you know, the former CEO of PepsiCo, and she conceded that having a family member watch her children, who was unpaid, was extremely helpful to her. So here we go. Why are we not thinking of a situation where family members can be compensated? They've now come up with this for elderly parents to get support payments. These are things we have to discuss. But when you have women who are unpaid, the unpaid labor, and it's not just women, it depends on who's the stay-at-home person who isn't pursuing a career that gets a paycheck. They're thought less of socially, and they are demeaned financially. And the consequences of that, they're bad now, but they're really bad as they get older. And the statistics for women at retirement age, they have less money in Social Security, if any. If you're on a job that's a cash job, you've never paid in. And women who were divorced were the worst statistics for how they would be financially at retirement. So the conversation is to get women in a position get people in a position where they can be compensated for their time and thinking of things in the long run and planning for it in a better way.
Well, one of the things I bring up in my book, as you know, is that it just seems incredible to me that we still have a system where if you're not working, but you're raising family, and not paying into the Social Security system, you don't draw Social Security. It's like, hey, you weren't sitting at home eating bonbons, watching television. You were raising the future of America and caring for these kids. And in today's climate, otherwise spending $2,600 per child for daycare a month. I mean, it's so stupid to me. And you know where I run into this on the personal level a little bit, and I talk about this too, and I have with you guys, is, hey, here I am, a white guy pushing 70 in my own home. And
we won't hold that against you, Frank.
Okay, but there I am. My grandchildren remind me of this. How old are you now? And my grandson Jack one time looked me right in the face and said, "When did you get old?" And I said, "Well, last Thursday," and I don't know what happened. Kids are great. But anyway, I notice even with people, it's like, "Oh, well, what are you doing? Are you writing a new book?" "Well, I'm taking care of my grandchildren." "Oh, okay." And then they move on. It's like going to those parties where they're always looking over your shoulder, trying to see if there's somebody actually important there that they can gravitate towards, that's going to get them, better connected than you are. Caregiving is not respected, and something has to change socially, politically, economically, and above all, just in terms of what's cool. I think maybe, have you noticed with some of the people you're interviewing who may be attached to younger men in those communities, or kids, that the younger male today is more likely to think about his caregiving role more seriously? Or are we just perpetuating this, hey, men don't do this business that I run into when I tell people I'm a full-time grandfather?
No, what do you think, Maura?
Well, I think, talking to Carol, her husband did take paternity leave. So that was a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, Stefan, who was a teacher and did it, and his first time was 15 years ago or so, and then second was 13 years ago. He actually hasn't seen many men doing it, or that's what he told us, although I think there are more, but it's still not enough. I mean, I think of all the people the men that either I worked with or my husband would come home and tell me that so-and-so just had a baby and nobody in the office even knew that one was due. Like, it was so separate.
But I'm a real data person, and we include a lot of research. Maura's always one to give the stats. We've looked at how things are in other countries. So sometimes in America, we would say, "Oh, it's great in England. It must be better there. Oh, it's great in France," or "Germany's better than us." And it's not really true. And there's data in the United Nations. They study the number of children people are having, paid leave, all of this. And in some countries where there's a lot of opportunity for socialized assistance, a certain group will have more children and others won't. And then there's other countries like France they have come up with a good system. They do have a safety net, but they have a culture where it's expected that you have children. So there's a cultural component. But when I have spoken with professional women who are on the higher strata, they're still having to pay for nannies. And there was one guest we tried to get that she woke up one day when her youngest was like 13 or 14 and said, "I haven't raised my kids," and quit her job and did something else. But you really have to explore the realities of how these different systems are to create something better. Just speculating, it might sound good, but it might not work.
Yeah, I remember a similar statistic I read about Sweden, where, of course, they're famous for the social safety net, but it's only now in the younger generation that are even taking advantage of the paid paternity leave. Most of the men weren't even taking it. And the ultimate example of that is Japan, where it's like the male there sees things, this is dishonorable. You wouldn't even consider it. So we have a big mountain to climb here. And, the thing that makes me sad just on a human level, in the same way that I'm sure you both are sad when in spite of the ups and downs with childcare and all the problems of children who have health issues or whatever it may be, this brings a lot of meaning to life. I won't say happiness because you're tired a lot of the time, but it brings meaning to life. I feel so sorry for men who have completely missed this, just judging by what I got back from my children when I was a young, very imperfect, kind of stupid father a lot of the time. Even so, I'm glad we had that experience. And then when it comes to my experience as a grandfather, this is the best time of my life. And I don't mean this shit about golden years. No, hell no. Who wants to get old? I'm just talking about, when you see how it really matters to you. So I don't know how to break through to that. It's just odd to me that I find it difficult to articulate to other males that they've really missed the boat on this, that it's a stupid way to live because,
Well, and
But
they live longer.
Frank,
yeah.
but Frank, there are a lot of people now who are deciding not to have children at all, men and women.
Which is unfortunate, I think.
Birth
And what do
rate
you
has
think
declined.
why do you think that's happening? Is it a sort of a discouragement with the future prospect of humankind, or is it just, hey, this isn't going to be good for my career? Or is it the sexual revolution left so much weird baggage behind that no one knows how to navigate? I mean,
It's
this is a
all of
real
it.
question. I have no theory. I'm asking you guys.
Maura?
From a career standpoint, I think people have put it off because they could see how hard it was for their parents. I do think that's part of it. And in general, it's just hard. And so I do think there are people who have opted, who are deciding not to. I had a college roommate who knew way back then that she never wanted to have children.
Sure.
She didn't, and she is perfectly happy.
Well, and I talk in my book, I say, hey, listen, I'm not saying everybody should have children. When I say fall in love, have children, I say, I'm talking about fall in love with love itself as the priority in your life, and have children in the sense that we're having them here today, in that you're on my podcast and we're unpacking your ideas the way a parent would with a child. I'm interested in you. This is caregiving. And you had me on your show and were kind enough to promote my book. That's caregiving. So it isn't just biological children we're talking about here. And I want to be very clear on that. That said, the people I feel sorry for are not the ones who decided not to have kids and are doing just fine. It's the person who keeps putting it off and believing this kind of delusional stuff about, well, once I get all my ducks in a row, okay, so I'm going to freeze some eggs now. And, all this kind of stuff. You kind of wonder why just some common sense about cycles of fertility, and not just fertility clocks, but emotional romantic clocks. All these other things have gone out the window and been replaced by a series of business directives that just don't match human biology.
Go ahead, Christie. Were you going to say something?
I just think that we should get the message out, Frank, that families are good. And that's what I liked about your book, in part, that you've had a joy in having your family. And I feel the same way. And let's tell people, cue them into it, hope they make better choices. Maura and I are older.
What about not just families, but relationships in general?
Yes.
I mean, do you find that people just don't get it? That if, I keep running into young people who say, oh, you married all this time and everything. How did you do that? Well, one way we did it is we were young and stupid enough to take a leap of faith, not expecting to have worked anything out. And it just seems that this sort of super, incremental steps thing in life where, first it's career and then education, and I better get my master's degree, and I can't fall in love in college because this is the wrong time. I mean, by the time you're done with all this planning, and then of course, as you both know, I know this for a fact, when you finally get there at any of these, quote, big stages, have a child, get married, live with one person, you didn't know anything anyway, even the parts you planned, because now you're changed and they have too.
Right. Well, one thing I wanted to say is all of our shows are available on our website, thebalancedilemma.com.
Which we will link to, by the way.
Yes, thank you. And we've gotten on all the platforms, so you can hear these stories that we've had with many of our guests. And it's been a real pleasure for us to, I think I've grown listening to the stories, and it's changed my ideas.
Has it changed, Maura and Christie, answer this however you want. Has it changed your own view of yourself as a woman, your own view of feminism, your own view of American history? Have you found that by talking to all these people for these 8 years, you have changed in some way and learned something that maybe you hadn't anticipated?
What I learned, it wasn't directly that. I've learned, and I learned this a lot from Christie's mom, was that it's never too late. Her mother keeps reinventing herself, and Christie and I have had to learn a whole lot of new things that we didn't know. She and I have different strengths, and so we have different roles at times, but we've had to learn so many new things, and that we can relate to people of all different ages. That there's a story in there that is unifying.
We did a class last night with college students, undergrads. And I felt I was on the same page as the undergrads. I don't think they had more knowledge than me. And some of the things, Maura and I already knew because we experienced them. But it's, yes, reinventing. Life is long. Maybe you're going to experience one thing at one time, and to do something later, you have to be optimistic, you have to be brave, and you have to go for it.
Well, hopefully, if you want children, and this goes for males or females, step up and bond with someone, and or at least take note of the fact that fertility, issues can't be solved by egg freezing and $1 billion fertility industry, that this is ridiculous. It's better to live your life in sensible stages that also accommodate, who we are physically as well. Let me remind people that we've been talking with Maura Carlin and Christie Derrico, who are hosts of The Balance Dilemma on WVOX, or is it QX? VOX, and whose parking lot I have been in. This has been really good. And we're going to put links to anything you want to link to, Maura and Christie. So tell Ernie, our producer, who you would like to be linked to, where our show goes. You will be linked to yours everywhere, and how you would like that done. So just before we go, Christie, are you working now as a lawyer? I know you're involved in so many different things. What are you spending most of your time doing these days?
It's a fractional analysis. We do our show, and I do have a law practice, and I have my family. And I am married a very long time also, and have a really supportive spouse. And the conversations I have with Maura and with you, I have had with my husband. It's been great.
That's good. And Maura, what are you up to right as we speak? I know you're doing the journalism and the show. You have the kids you're working with.
I still do interviews for our local TV station. I am the editor of a luxury handbag website. So always writing news and articles and editing for that. And managing family, because even when the kids are grown, they're not completely gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And you both now, Christie, I know you're part of the Women's Business Collaborative, isn't that correct?
Well, through Jose, I've been involved in that.
And Maura, have you gotten into that at all with Jose and with Edie Fraser and the gang?
I have been attending their webinars, which I found fascinating, and we've gotten to know some of the guests. We just had Gloria Felt on today, who we met through Jose's group, and it was a fascinating discussion with her.
That's great. Well, listen, it's really a pleasure. I hope to see you both again soon, as we can. So anytime you want to talk about anything, just tell me or Ernie, and we'll have you back on to tell us what you're doing and it's of interest that you'd like to share. And we will link to everything and everywhere that you want to be linked to. So thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Frank.
Really
it's been
nice.
A pleasure.
Yeah, same here. Thanks. Bye.